de la Universidad de Guadalajara, el doctor Héctor Raúl Solís Gadea. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Saludo a nuestro rector del Centro Universitario de Ciencias Económico-Administrativas, el maestro Luis Gustavo Padilla Montes. De la misma forma, al director del Instituto de Investigación en Políticas Públicas y Gobierno, el doctor Enrique Cabrero Mendoza. Quiero saludar a nuestros invitados especiales, José Luis Méndez, vicepresidente del International Public Policy Association. De la misma forma, presento a Philippe Souton, secretario general del International Public Policy Association. Y nos acompaña también Leslie Pal, tesorero de este mismo organismo. Como moderador estará nuestro amigo el doctor Oliver Mesa. Él es coordinador del Instituto de Investigación en Políticas Públicas de CUSEA. Quiero destacar también la presencia del doctor Antonio Sánchez Bernal, él es director de la División de Economía y Sociedad. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos, doctor. Al doctor Alberto Becerra Santiago, jefe del Departamento de Políticas Públicas. Y agradecer la presencia de todas y todos ustedes en este Seminario Permanente de Políticas Públicas. Si bien para dar comienzo, dejaré en el uso de la voz al doctor Oliver Mesa, quien estará fungiendo como moderador. Adelante.
Cierto, nos acompaña David Gómez Álvarez, que fue coordinador de ese libro que se presentó, y bueno, pues eso permitió que estuviera participando con nosotros Luis Aguilar Villanueva y que, bueno, pues digamos, hiciera de alguna forma también una despedida que por cuestiones de la pandemia y eso, pues en su retiro no había tenido la oportunidad. Tuvimos también actividades importantes en la Feria Internacional del Libro, tuvimos el foro del futuro de las universidades con la participación del rector Graue de la UNAM, el rector Villanueva de nuestra universidad, así como el ministro de Universidades de España, Joan Subirats, y la presidenta del Colegio de México, Silvia Giorguli. Este fue un evento importante porque parte de la agenda del instituto también tiene que ver con la política educativa y la política pública en las universidades. Igualmente en la FIL tuvimos un foro sobre cambio tecnológico en la sociedad del conocimiento, en el que participaron diversos colegas. Fue un foro ese sí a distancia, porque un participante estaba en Qatar, otro estaba en Alemania, otro estaba en Suiza, otro estaba en Estados Unidos. Entonces, bueno, se prefirió esa modalidad. Pero también el tema importa, porque otra de las líneas de trabajo prioritarias del instituto es el tema de cambio tecnológico en las políticas públicas. ¿Cómo incide el cambio tecnológico en la hechura de las políticas públicas? Por eso, pues fue importante también ese evento y fue marcando otro de las áreas que nos interesa trabajar en el instituto. Igualmente en la FIL hubo la presentación de 3 libros, entre ellos quiero destacar uno sobre gobernanza metropolitana. Aquí está su autora, la doctora Ana Díaz Aldret, y menciono este libro porque esa es una tercera área de trabajo que queremos también fortalecer en el instituto, que la política metropolitana y sus componentes, porque sabemos que la política metropolitana pues tiene muchos componentes, pero esto va desde la conceptualización de qué es la gobernanza metropolitana hasta el tema de las smart cities y todo esto que ahora tenemos presente. Para el 2023, la agenda del instituto también es una agenda interesante e intensa. Para nosotros es muy importante era muy importante crear un espacio de intercambio académico, ¿sí? Más allá de los eventos, digamos, más amplios, donde uno invita pues también a gente externa, en fin, funcionarios, todo eso. Además de esos eventos, nos interesaba mucho tener un evento de naturaleza fundamentalmente académica, y es este seminario permanente que hoy se pone en marcha con invitados pues de primer nivel, como ya fueron presentados, en este caso de la Asociación Internacional de Políticas Públicas, pero más allá de que vengan como representantes de la asociación, pues cada uno de ellos es un académico muy destacado en sus áreas, ¿no? Yo solamente quisiera de pasada decir que Philippe Citon es profesor en la Universidad de Lyon. Entre sus muchas obras, una que yo quisiera mencionar es una que tuvo como título La Fabrique politique en politique publique, une approche pragmatique de la acción publique, que luego fue traducido al inglés. Es una obra que también ya está traducida al inglés y que tiene una presencia muy importante en el mundo de las políticas públicas. Y les digo, solo estoy mencionando un producto muy importante de su larga carrera. En el caso de Leslie Pal, a quien también le agradecemos mucho su presencia, él trabaja en la Universidad Hamad bin Khalifa en Qatar, y una de sus obras muy importantes, The Future of the Policy Sciences, también yo quisiera mencionarla porque me parece que es una obra muy trascendente. Y en el caso de José Luis Méndez, del Colegio de México, a quien también igualmente le agradecemos su presencia, bueno, pues él en parte nos va a platicar también de su libro que tiene apenas creo que un año circulando, ¿no, José Luis? Sobre políticas públicas en América Latina, que yo creo que es un libro importante, que era esperado desde hace tiempo por la comunidad de estudiosos en política pública. Pero bueno, lo que quiero, además de darles la bienvenida y resaltar la calidad y el alto nivel de nuestros participantes, esta es la esencia, la idea del seminario permanente, que colegas del CUSEA, que colegas de otros centros universitarios que estén desarrollando investigación en política pública puedan participar en este espacio, puedan en algunos momentos presentar sus trabajos de investigación, y también estudiantes del programa doctoral o de los doctorados que tienen que ver con estas áreas de conocimiento, serán todos ellos bienvenidos. Estamos afinando el formato, como se darán ustedes cuenta. Se nos ocurrió que un poco a la europea y a la americana un launch seminario sería una buena idea. Entonces, por eso la hora, puede ser que la recorramos un poco más temprano y que pongamos mesas. Yo creo que eso, para que no se nos caiga la torta. De hecho, yo tengo el gran dilema de que me voy a querer comer la torta, pero enfrente de ustedes me va a dar mucha pena estar comiendo una torta. Entonces, bueno, vamos a ir afinando esos detalles, ¿no? Pero bueno, además del seminario permanente que hoy inicia, vamos a tener el coloquio anual en algún momento del año. Todos ustedes serán invitados. Seminario 1 o 2 sobre temas específicos. Estamos en proyecto de proponer algunos diplomados y otra vez una participación muy intensa en la Feria Internacional del Libro. Entonces, bueno, lo que queremos también es que pues estar en contacto con ustedes. Les agradecemos mucho su presencia y los estaremos convocando a ustedes y a otros que hoy no estuvieron a que vengan enriqueciendo este trabajo. Muchas gracias a todos, bienvenidos, y le regreso la palabra a Oliver para dar inicio ya al evento. Gracias.
Quien nos va a ofrecer una ponencia titulada The Politics of Policy Making, Meaning Struggles in Multiple Arenas. Permíteme presentar un poquito más al doctor Philippe, además de lo que ya dijo el profesor Enrique. Philippe Citon es profesor investigador de Ciencias Políticas en la Universidad de Lyon, es secretario general de la Asociación Internacional de Políticas Públicas, es coeditor de la serie internacional sobre políticas públicas para la editora Palgrave Macmillan y forma parte del consejo editorial de muchas revistas científicas, como por ejemplo Critical Policy Studies, Journal of Comparative Policy Analysis, Policy Studies Journal, Policy and Society, Policy Research Journal. Ha sido profesor visitante en la Universidad de Yale y ha dado conferencias en diferentes universidades. Actualmente ha publicado 11 libros y un gran número de artículos. Entre sus libros más recientes, The Politics of Meaning Struggles, Shale Gas Policy Under Pressure in France, con Sébastien Chilot. The Political Formulation of Policy Solution, con Frank Fisher, Nicholas Hardis. The Political Process of Policy Making, a Pragmatic Approach to Public Policy, entre otros títulos. Sus estudios se centran en un enfoque constructivista y pragmático de la formulación de políticas, con especial atención a la dimensión política, el papel de la pericia, los expertos, y las luchas de sentido desarrolladas en las múltiples arenas ocultas durante el proceso de políticas públicas. So thank you, Philippe, for your conference, and the floor is yours, as we say.
Yeah. Okay, so just to say thank you first, like this, I can, when there is some blank, we can do a lot of things. So thank you to host me. Thank you very much. And it's a real pleasure. Maybe give you just a few words about the association. So IPPA, the International Public Policy Association, is actually become the most important association in the world about public policy. So we organize an important conference every 2 years. Next one will be in Toronto in June. And if you are interested, the call for paper is open until 7 days. So end of January. So you have time. But just for the joke, so we receive generally 2,000 papers, but 1,000 arrive the last day. And the workshop is another way to also facilitate discussion about public policy at international level. For us, research at international level is something very important. And as I said all the time, and I repeat in our previous meeting, internationalization is do not be homogeneization. It's not the Coca-Cola style. Everyone's, whatever the country is, drink the same. No, it's not possible. But we can learn from each other a lot. So what I would like to do today in a short version, because we did the long version in Mexico, this is why it's right in Mexico, is just to present a part of my works. So I can, it's not one, it's one approach, one view about what is public policy and how we can work on public policy. There is a multiple way to work on public policy. I understand that a lot of you works on public policy in his own way. So I would like to present something which is, I can say, not the dominant view of public policy. It's how I work on public policy and what we can learn from public policy studies. So this is a few of my books, and I would like to speak to you about the last one, The Politics of Meaning Struggles, which is an empirical case. Because I'm sure you're very interested about what's happened in France. But certainly the main idea is to say how we study public policy, how we can study public policy. So I give you my example about what I do in France, but it's just an example that you can use everywhere. So I will begin by a question. The more classical question when you begin something about public policy. What is public policy? What is fascinating? We can say that the first study on public policy is probably 1950 with the famous book of Policy Sciences by Laswell, but so it's 70 years, not agree about a common definition about what is public policy. So just to give you maybe some of them you know well, like Thomas Dye, who say, oh, it's whatever government choose to do or not to do. It's do this in 1978. Laswell, for him, it was just an important decision. And Eclos, another famous in 1970, said, oh, it's something bigger than a simple decision by a government, but it's something smaller than everything. So with this, we don't know a lot of things. And Guy Peters, someone important, the founding president, the first president of IPPA, said it's a set of activities of government with the purpose of changing their economy and society. The study of public policy is understanding what government do and their effect on citizens. So many definitions. Why they don't find a common definition? All these researchers work a lot and who like to make definition but don't arrive to do one. Something is interesting, if you come back to the famous definition of Thomas Dye, we say it's whatever government choose to do or not. This guy worked in 1970s and make like a point. In 1917, he found 40 definitions of public policy, which is a lot. I don't want to know how many now. More than 200, 300, 400, I don't know. And he said, oh, my definition is not the definition. It's a minimum definition which seems to be common in every definition, what government do. But as you understand, he's not really satisfied. And if you see, for example, Paul Kearney's famous textbook, he said, oh, about this. So, and I can show you a lot of things. Oh, I need to follow my time because I don't want to speak 45 minutes this time. Sorry. So, all this definition is why it's so complex to define public policy. Why we have so many difficulties. It's something that we try to understand. Is it because there is so many meanings or because something else? And what is interesting is if the researchers have so many difficulties to define public policy, if you ask to any member of government, of policy makers, ask to your government, to your Ministry of Housing, oh, what is housing policy? They have a definition about housing policy. If you ask to environmental policy, every policy makers have definition about what is the specific public policy he work on. Which means that there is a gap between the researcher who don't arrive to define their object and the actor itself who have no problem to define what is public policy for them. So maybe we can go in another way. In a lot of researchers try to find their own definition of public policy. Why we don't just look more precisely to policymakers how they do, how they build a public policy, how they make public policy, how they define public policy. Why we don't observe concretely, empirically, what they do, better than define ourselves what is public policy. I would like to give you an example. I can't have time to give you more detail. It's about a policy I study. I don't know if you know what is shale gas. I don't know if you have shale gas in Mexico. No? Yes, you have. Okay. So you know what is it. Shale gas was the golden age. Suddenly in 2006-07, United States, it's an old idea, the shale gas, but before we don't know how to have it. But in 2006-2007, there is a lot of US startup, not a big group, US startup who find a new method to have the shale gas. And suddenly in 3 or 4 years, US who have less and less oil and gas become again the first country on gas, which is crazy. It changed all the things. And how you know about Ukraine, even if it's far away for you, but I suppose you know that, energy is one of the main reasons of the war everywhere. It's not nothing. Have your energy policy is not just a market problem. It's also a geopolitical problem. So if you change the map of who have the gas and who have not, you change the geopolitical situation. So my question was, in French, the French Parliament have decided in 2011 to forbid to ban shale gas exploration in France. And it was the first country. After this, other countries do this. Why they do this? Why they decide to define differently their energy policy? Is it something obvious, easy? So I use a sentence. Everyone know Nicolas Sarkozy, our old president in France, and he say, oh, it was not president in 2014, and he said, I can't accept that US become independent in terms of energy because shale gas, and France can't receive the benefit of this new energy when unemployment ravages so many family and territory. It is unacceptable. You know, policy is not nothing. It's about how family live, how territory live, how unemployment can ravage or not ravage. It's a view with this discourse. You see suddenly how a choice can be interpreted or give meaning as a way to change society. If you remember what Segai Peters in his definition, policy is a way that government try to change society. And Sarkozy say, oh, it's unacceptable. But what is really funny in this story is that the president who decided to ban shale gas, his name was Nicolas Sarkozy. So what is unacceptable in 2014 was not only acceptable, but it was the decision of the president of France in 2011. Why? Why they do this? How they decide? How they change their public policy? How it's work? How they define this? And how we can observe this? And one of the questions I would like to ask is, what is the venue we need to observe? If we want to understand government, what is mean? How it's work? Why French government had changed? In the policy studies, we have a lot of classical reason. So, sorry for this little part, I will be little criticize a lot of my colleagues, but it's a game of the research. We need to criticize ourselves also to produce knowledge. So, what is the classical reason? The classical model was developed in literature and policy making is the idea that most of the public policy was born and developed and made in what they call a policy subsystem or a policy system or a community networks. It's something like a concept, little middle concept, a policy subsystem where you have a lot of experts, and a lot of experts don't like too many change. They are more or less incremental, so they don't like too much the change, but they are the owner of the system. And they imagine that the change is not coming from them, it's coming from different reasons that they try to find, which is generally outside of the system. So let's examine some kind of classical reason of change. One of the most famous is what we call the weight of interest group. Everyone know about this. It's this idea that more a group, an interest group is powerful, more you have chance to push the government to decide in his favor. There is a famous Italian philosopher, Colin Crouch, who worked on post-democracy, and say today the interest group is so strong that government at national level have no power. So it's not democracy. In this case, it was funny. Why? Because who win? Who was against banning? The big group, Total in France. It's one of the most important international groups we have. The president, you see what he said. He was not in favor to ban shale gas. The prime minister was not really in favor. Europe, not really in favor. And who was for ban shale gas? The Ministry of Environment. But I just put you the list. Generally, the Ministry of Environment stay 3 months, 4 months in the government, and whoop, they change. Because it's not a good position to be Ministry of Environment. You have not a lot of power. The local mayor, but they have not a lot of things. So, environmental activists. So, if environmental activists change the government, we know that. But in this case, it was not the group who seems too strong who win. So, the concept of weight doesn't work, except if you say that the one who win have the weight, and not the weight is the cause of what he win. It's what we call a tautology. you explain by the reason you give. It's not work. Let's continue. Mobilization. It's an interesting thing. You see in China, mobilization can change even a Chinese government. So, in this case, there is only 10,000 participants in the mobilization. If you compare, we have a pension reform a few years ago, it was 1 million of persons, and they don't arrive to change the position of the government. So how 10,000 people can change the position of government? It's not work. So, third, to give, it's a classical in policy studies. It's say, there is some event who contribute to the change, like political election, but I don't know in Mexico, but in France there is election every 2 years, so it means that election is not a reason, because it's every time. Another one which is more interesting is probably the concept of agenda, but you probably heard about this. Is the idea that suddenly a topic arrives in the media. And it's true in the case of shale gas. See here, it's the number of articles. So, French authorized shale gas exploration in March 2010, and it was here, there is no newspaper, no article. 6 months later, there is a beginning of mobilization, and every day you have article in shale gas, about shale gas. It means that in March 2010, no one knows in France what is shale gas. 6 months after, everyone knows what is shale gas. It's interesting thing. But it's a good element to say, maybe it's a way to understand why the government changed. But the problem is this. The government not change one time. Not take one decision. It take 3 different decisions in 3 months. It's curious. We have the idea that we can explain a government position because we find why they choose one position. But when they change all the time their position, how you can explain? The first time they say, it was the 27th January, the Ministry of Environment say, there is no environmental problem with shale gas. We are not US, in France, but I don't know here. US is always bad. So we are not US, we are serious. We have norms. We do things seriously. And it's juridically impossible to frozen the license we gave. This is what says the government the 27th January. 3 days later, the 1st February, 4 days later, the same ministry say, finally we frozen the license. You know what was impossible 3 days before, suddenly become possible. Interesting. And we not really know if shale gas is dangerous, so we asked 4 experts, which is high civil servant, to make a report. We have 2 months to make us a report to know if shale gas is dangerous or not. 2 months after, before that the expert gives a report, a new law was proposed in the parliament to ban shale gas. And this solution win at the end. So, I mean that each time I try to find an explanation, it's not work. Because it can work for 1, but never for 3. How a government change their position? Where it come from? To understand this, and I have not, I go directly, I just want to highlight 2 things. The first is always to understand what says a loser, because the story is always made by the winner. We know that. So, see, and in this case, it's funny because the loser is the president of Total. And what says the president of Total? He say, I'm fascinated by the way the term fracking has crystallized so many divisions. In the United States, they speak about massaging. I don't know where he saw that, but no importance. Maybe it's an idea. What says the president of Total? He say he lose something. He lose the meaning struggle. He lose the capacity to impose the idea that shale gas is benefic for France. He lose this because fracking was, the meaning about fracking was win by the opponent in the media to say fracking is an environmental problem. So it's a first idea. There is a battle in the media, and they lose the battle. So it means that this battle, this struggle, this meaning struggle is central. But it's not enough to understand. Because there is a lot of cases when you can find in media something and the government do something else. So we never need to be. So what I do, and I have only 3 minutes to finish, so I just you to highlight 2 things and to give you 2 examples. First idea is to If you want to understand policy making, you need to go not at the mid-level, but at the micro level. It means that the venue is inside all the detail. So to understand what's happened, I need to go in all the multiple office, in all the bureaucracy who take this question in charge. You have to go in the ministry, in the department, in the chief of department, in the interministerial struggling discussion, in the interest group, not in one. Total is not one. It's a multiple of actors. There is division also inside Total, like there is division inside the bureaucracy, like there is division everywhere. If I want to understand, I need to change what is the venue. The second is to observe all the time what they do, policymakers, what the definition practice, how they define shale gas, how they change, how it's work. Third, it's to observing how they build a coalition, how they arrive to be agree one with another. You know, it's little like a virus. Never imagine that public policy, it's one good solution, everyone is okay. In any public policy, there is winner and there is loser. If you say, I ban shale gas, you have loser, and you have winner. If you say, I don't ban shale gas, you have loser. Public policy is politics. It means that there is no one, everyone win. It's impossible. So it means that there is conflict. What kind of conflict there is to understand what was the solution? To understand this, and I finish on these 2 points, the first is to try to better understand what I call the different venue. I identified 3 kinds of venue that I work on, and I give you example just after. The first one I don't develop, I call this the mediatic forum. It's the idea when you speak, when you have a meaning struggle about shale gas in the media, is not the same that if you have in a discussion between colleagues. The rule of how you speak, you know, I speak in front of you, you can't answer now. So it's a public purpose. It have its own rules. I can't say, oh, I don't want to speak to this way or this way. I don't want to give this argument or this. I can say, I don't say, oh, I don't want to hurt Total. If I do this in public, you kill me. If I'm the prime minister, not if I'm a researcher. So public policy, public forum have its own rule, like the Roman, you know, who have the right to speak and to say what. The second thing is, most of the public policy is built in the hidden space. And this is why it's interesting. I identified 2 kinds of hidden space, what I call the atrium and what I call the arena. Atrium is what? Is the idea that it's an office, for example, if you take, be in a meeting with a juridical specialist, and they speak about the law. Don't know if there is jurists here, probably. So, if you don't know anything about the law, you just listen. You have no argument. They know what is the truth in terms of juridical things. They are the owner of the meeting. I call this an atrium. Like in the Roman way, it's a house with the owner. They know they have the power and they have a regime of debate. It's how I can give the truth. And we have another kind of space of debate. I call this the arena. It's when there is no dominant actors. When they fight. Just give you an example. I do this quickly to finish, because they kill me after this if I don't. Just want to give you where this solution come from. What is interesting, and I finish on this, we have 3 solutions. And what I try to do is, who have built each of the solutions? How many versions there is for each solution? And who have the policymakers governs? The first one, you give you one example, and for the rest you can go on the book. The first one is, you remember the ministry say, oh, there is no problem. We are not US. You know, and juridically we can't frozen. Where it come from? In the reality, we can follow the process. In the following process, what's happened? There is a beginning of mobilization. There is a cabinet of the ministry who say, oh, we receive call from the journalist who ask us a position about shale gas. But they know nothing about shale gas. So what they do? They ask to the chief of department of energy. What do the chief of department? They know nothing about shale gas. They ask to his Visdin. What do the vice dean? They know nothing about this. They ask to the chief of office who is in charge of this and who have the monopoly of knowledge. And suddenly, you see, this is the direction of Department of Energy. There is a little office where everything is built in terms of solution. In this office, they are the gatekeeper of the law. They know everything about the law, specifically about the law to have the right to say. I say, oh, come on, you're crazy. It's impossible to frozen for us. We are the gatekeeper of the law. And in the law, it's impossible. This is how the first solution emerged, because at the end, they give the answer to the director, the chief of department, who gives to the cabinet and who gives to the ministry. But when the ministry say that in the public way is not the little atrium of these actors. The public way have other rules of debate. It's a struggle place. And the opponents say, oh, you say US, we are not US. But all the companies come from US. All the brevets come from US. And frozen, politically, you can't freeze. So the ministry suddenly receive a lot of critics. And he don't want to be critics. He's not really about shale gas. So what he do? He asks to his chief of department. But the chief of department really don't like this person of the office. He find this very too rigorous. They just think in terms of law. So they propose a new way. What is the new way? They say, oh, we can introduce new actors. High civil servant like us, says the chief of department. Suddenly, they change the rule of the game. Who is expert is not only this office, is new actors. And this is how the second solution emerged. So what is interesting, I just conclude about this, because I'm too long, I'm sorry. It's what? It's understanding the policy process is need to be observed concretely what's happened. It's also observe the trajectory in terms of each step can modify the step after. It's not only a big cause, a big reason. It's also something which provokes something, which provokes something. You know, it's like something like a soccer game. It's not because you have two enormous team, excellent team, but the game is finished. No, sometimes you don't know why. France win, Brazil win, I don't know about Mexican win, I don't know. So there is a lot of uncertainty in the process. And the uncertainty is something essential that we need to be careful. And just to conclude, it's just to say to you that, so policy is not like, say, Laswell, but it's apolitical things. Because Laswell defends the idea that it's policy, you know, English word, in English you have two words, policy and politics. And sometimes some people say in their textbook, oh, English is wonderful. They have two words. But in French, but I think in Spain too, in Spanish too, and in German too, we have only one word, and it's not just an error. Politics and policy is the same. Because when you do policy, you do politics, and vice versa, even if you are a technician. And what is interesting in this case is the best solution, the solution who win, was not the best one. You know the Scrabble game? Everyone know that. The person who wins is not the person who has the best word in his chevalet. How you say chevalet? No, before you play on the table, you know, you have the best word. But if you can put in any place, it's not work. The best player is a player who finds a solution which corresponds to a multiple arrangement on the table. This metaphor coming from Bruno Latour, and I like it. And this is what we observe. The multiple network who need to be involved in a solution, which is a political solution. So, and if you want to do more detail, I encourage you to see the book. So, thank you very much.
The presentations, and then at the end we can take some questions. Would that be good for you? Very well. So our next speaker is Leslie Pal. I'm going to read in Spanish, Leslie, because you already know yourself. Is that okay? Leslie es decano fundador de la Facultad de Políticas Públicas de la Universidad Hamad bin Khalifa en Doha, Qatar. Es autor, coautor y editor de más de 30 libros. Los más recientes son Acción Informativa, Educación Superior contrarrestando el extremismo violento, El futuro de las ciencias de la ciencia de política, Gobernanza global y organizaciones musulmanes, entre muchos otros libros. Ha publicado más de 90 artículos y capítulos del libro en una amplia variedad de áreas de política pública y administración y reforma de la gestión pública internacional. Sus artículos han aparecido en revistas como Governance, Policy Science, Journal of Comparative Policy Analysis, Canadian Political Science Review. En fin, es editor o fue editor de el Journal of Comparative Policy Analysis de 2015 al 2020 y actualmente es miembro de los consejos editoriales del International Review of Public Policy, que es la revista de la Asociación Internacional en Políticas Públicas. Bien, voy a ser un poco más breve con la semblanza. Leslie nos va a presentar una ponencia titulada Global Citizenship, Sustainable Development Goals and Identity Politics in Global Policy Making.
Once again, to express my gratitude, as Philippe did, to our colleagues here at the university and the tremendous show of support that they provided to us and have provided to us, but particularly this afternoon with the meeting with the administration and other colleagues who are very interested in having the International Workshop on Public Policy here. And we're delighted to be here to visit and look at the facilities and talk with colleagues. So thank you again for this kind invitation. Before I actually begin the presentation, which like Philippe's we gave in Mexico City in a more elaborated version. So I'm going to give you just elements of it. Hopefully it'll be coherent. But before we get into the presentation, and hopefully the slides will come up in a moment, let me start with a little bit of backdrop or background to my own intellectual interests that will help you understand, I think, this what I hope is the significance of the research that I'm doing. One of the areas that I've been really interested in is policy transfer or policy diffusion, and that's connected to trying to understand global policy processes. When you listen to Philippe's presentation, for example, most of his focus of his case study is on France, on shale gas in France. But recall that in many instances he was referring to how the French were talking about what the Americans were doing. And they didn't want to do what the Americans were doing, or they wanted to do what the Americans were doing, depending on who the different actors were. So the point there is that public policy never takes place simply within national boundaries. There's Mexican policymakers, Canadian policymakers, French policymakers are always looking around at other examples and other standards. And that often leads to borrowing or transfer or copying what seemed to be successful, or resisting and rejecting what seemed to be unsuccessful policies that are exercised in other jurisdictions. And the other element of this for all of you to keep in mind is that this kind of process of global cross-national conversations about public policy also take place at the global level with international organizations. And it's not just about the making of international law, it's often about the promotion of international standards, of international practices, of different kinds of policy tools. These sorts of things emanate, for example, from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, based in Paris. I did a book a few years ago on the role of the OECD in global conversations around public management reform, because it struck me at one point that it was amazing that so many countries, including Latin American countries, were often talking about the same kinds of public sector reforms in the same way, around the same issues, with the same language and the same concepts. So was this just accidental? No. It was partly because the World Bank was talking about these things, the IMF was talking about these things, the OECD was talking about these things. So there are these global conversations that set the context for policy transfer or policy diffusion. So that's just the backdrop of what I wanted to to provide with you. It'll make a little bit more sense, I think, of both the content of my presentation, but also the conclusions. So the title of the talk was Global Citizenship, SDGs, and Identity Politics. Go back there, in global policy making. So I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to talk about a particular research project that I'm currently involved in that is looking at SDG education, the Sustainable Development Goals. I think most of you know what that is, but I'll just provide a little bit of a brief background on it. Then I want to move to an element of that, which is global citizenship education. And then from there, I just want to draw out some possible conclusions or reflections about policy transfer and what all that means. So first of all, let me skip over here. The SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. I think everybody pretty much understands what these are about. You've seen this multicolored graph in various formats. Now think about this for a moment. All of you probably have a sense of what this is all about. This is a global policy agenda. This was agreed unanimously by the United Nations in 2015 as a follow-up to the Millennial Goals, but we'll set that aside. In 2015, all the countries on the planet, think about that for a minute, every country on the planet agreed to support the Sustainable Development Goals, these 17 goals, and to try to achieve them by 2030. Therefore, there's an Agenda 2030. And you know, this is just not something written on paper or a pretty chart. It ends up cascading, as I say there. The 17 goals have been elaborated into 169 targets, and those 169 targets have 232, not 230, not 233, but 232 indicators. And once you have goals and targets and indicators, you can measure how far along is Mexico to achieving Sustainable Development Goal 4 or 5 or 7 or 12. How far is Canada along, or France, or any other country? And that's exactly the game that's being played, because different organizations, including the UN, produce these kind of league tables and reports on an annual basis about where different countries are in their journey toward 2030 and achieving these Sustainable Development Goals. And these goals are a mix of more technical kinds of objectives around clean water and air. They're environmental goals around sustainability. There are goals about technology, for example, and industry and economy, about achieving certain outcomes in terms of GDP and growth and infrastructure. And some of them have to do with equity issues, like gender equity, and services like quality education. So it's a mix of very many things. It's a global agenda, and it's being pursued not just by the UN, but of course by all of the different countries who've agreed in some measure to implement and move ahead, because somebody's reporting on them. You know, every year there's a Sustainable Development Goals report. Every country and every Ministry of Foreign Affairs has to tell some of its bureaucrats to gather information from every other ministry, because they have to report. And there are NGOs like Hungry Wolves, you know, circling around the SDGs, looking for victims, you know, who is behind. It's like well, I won't go into analogies here, but, you know, they're measuring and assessing, and all of this gets reported in one way or another. So the SDGs are a fairly serious international, I call it an Uber policy agenda, that many countries have to accommodate themselves to. So what is my project? The project that I'm a principal investigator on is SDG education and global citizenship in Qatar. So I'm a dean of a college of public policy at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Education City in Doha, Qatar. That's a mouthful, but that's where I currently am. And this project is funded by the Qatar National Research Fund. It's about a $4.2 million 5-year project looking at SDG education around the world, and not just the SDGs, but SDG education, its connection to global citizenship, and then trying to provide some support to ministries of education and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Qatar about its geopolitical strategies, but also its educational strategies in terms of developing a concept of global citizenship and delivering it in primary and secondary education. So it's a mix, and again, for the students in the audience, people working in the policy field are often on two sides. They're doing primary research, which is often driven by theoretical issues like the ones that Philippe was sharing with you. What is the policy process? How do we understand it? What are the best theories? But a lot of our work is going to be at the service of government. We're trying to improve people's lives and make a contribution to public policy. And so this is an example of a large project that is doing both. Qatar, as you know, is an Islamic monarchy. It's officially a Muslim country, so it makes sense to be looking at this particular subject. 4 and 6 are looking at SDG literacy and piloting interventions in Qatar schools. So those PIs, principal investigators, are working quite closely with the Ministry of Education. Sub-project 5 is embedding SDGs and global citizenship into ethical education framework. The Ministry of Education is very interested in the ethical dimension of education, and so the SDGs are part of that. 7 is on reporting, and 8 is on moving beyond the classroom, so it's connecting different actors within civil society and other partners to try to deliver SDG education. So back to sub-project 1, I'm looking at localizing international best practices and policies. So at a very low level, empirical level, my project is about looking at, remember, policy transfer, diffusion, borrowing, stealing, copying. What are the best practices in SDG education, in the education around the Sustainable Development Goals? And how can we harvest that into a kind of database that would be accessible? And we offer it, of course, to the Qatari authorities, but it'll become an open access public resource. So in principle, after 5 years, we might have, and we're getting there within, I've got a small research team, but within a year or two, we will have hundreds and hundreds of different pedagogical materials for every grade level that you can think of, primary, secondary, even in post-secondary education, because universities like this one are very much involved and dedicated to SDG education in one way or another. And that will be a compendium. Now, others are doing this too. We are not alone. So there are other ministries, there are institutes, there are think tanks, there are NGOs that are producing these kinds of materials as well. So we're standing on their shoulders and pulling this stuff together. But at that level, we'll be producing this kind of compendium of empirical materials. But that's relatively easy to do. It's just kind of a hunting and gathering exercise, and you pull it all together. More interesting from a theoretical perspective is, for me, the policy transfer aspect of it. So you noticed both in the title of the project, it's SDG Education and Global Citizenship, and you see that combination in some of the titles of the sub-projects. It's pretty clear that SDG education is very closely connected to global citizenship, because SDG education is not just about telling people, children, let's say, that the climate is in trouble, we're getting hotter, these are the things we need to do with fish or animals or biodiversity. It's not just the delivery of facts, it's got another dimension to it, which was recognized right from the very beginning, that it must develop a different kind of orientation and identity on the part of students and citizens. It's not just about technical transfer of empirical knowledge, it's also, and this is why I find it interesting, about identity formation. It's changing the way people think, right? If you're gonna have if you're gonna reach the Sustainable Development Goals, you have to have sustainable economies. To have sustainable economies and sustainable societies, you have to have citizens who are contributing in sustainable ways, right? So it gets to the very simple level of recycling, of not throwing your garbage out, of thinking about the planet and thinking as a person worried about the planet and these things. So My point is that the SDGs is a global agenda, but it's something that requires global norms and loyalties to them. And I have a quote here, I don't know if you can read it, it's probably bigger there. I won't torture you with my attempt at Italian pronunciation, but the English translation, this is from an Italian statesman in the mid-1800s, after Italy had been actually united. Remember, Italy was fragmented in different principalities, and it was only in the mid-19th century that Italy was united into a national state. And this Italian statesman said famously, "We have made Italy. Now we must make Italians." So what does he mean by that? We've made a juridical entity. We've made a policy that is a national formation, but we now must make the people who identify themselves as members of that juridical entity. We have made a shape on a map. Now we must make people who believe themselves to be part of that map. We've made Italy, now we must make Italians. So my argument is that the SDGs, the UN, the countries of the world have made global policy, but now they must make global citizens. They must create these identities that are affiliated with and support the SDGs. And you can see right at the beginning, SDG 4, which is about quality education. And ask yourself for a moment, that's all it says. SDG 4 is quality education. What would that mean? So it's got to be elaborated in terms of targets like, reading and writing skills and a whole bunch of other things. So the indicators are, so target number 4.7 out of the, for SDG 4 reads as follows: by 2030, ensure that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills, so this is kind of technical, knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including among others, education for sustainable development to sustainable lifestyles. Right? Don't throw out your garbage, recycle, don't drive your car, take public transit, all of those messages that keep hammered at us all the time. Human rights, now you're getting into something more interesting, right? Gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace and nonviolence, and global citizenship. I've emphasized this, global citizenship and appreciation of cultural diversity and of culture's contribution to sustainable development. So, we begin with quality education, and then we elaborate that in target 4, starting with fairly technical stuff, right? It's just skills, knowledge to promote sustainable well-being. And then, wow, suddenly we're into human rights, gender equality, promotion of peace, love, brotherhood, sisterhood, and global citizenship. So it's very clear right from the beginning that this was not just a technical transfer of knowledge, but an attempt to shape identities and orientations of people. And this was well known even in 2012. Ban Ki-moon, who was became the UN he was the UN General Secretary at the time, launched an initiative called Global Education First. And the priority for that initiative was to foster global citizenship. And then this was folded into SDG 4. So the question then is, what is a global citizen and what is global citizenship? And this is actually pertinent to the people here in this room, because I learned this afternoon in the presentation that our colleagues here at the university made, that this university, the University of Guadalajara, is actually dedicated. One of its targets, one of its goals and objectives is global citizenship. I don't know if the rest of you, it jumped off the screen at me because I knew I was going to be giving this talk in a moment. So your own university is actually dedicated to supporting this agenda and sustainable development around SDGs and quality education and global citizenship. So the question is, what does it mean? I'm not going to, because of time, I'm not going to go into it into great detail, but when we think of citizenship, we think typically of citizenship with respect to a juridical entity of the state. Your citizenship is linked to the nation state. How can you be a global citizen when there's no global world government? You can't be a citizen of the UN. You can't be a citizen of the World Bank. You can't be a citizen of Mercosur. You can't be a citizen of you can be a citizen of the European Union, I guess, but that's about as broad and as big as it gets. So when you don't have a juridical entity at the global level, what can global citizenship be about? And I would argue that it actually comes down to 3 things, one of which is not there, but Jose Luis reminded me of it when I gave my first presentation, and I was embarrassed to have left it out. But there are three things that actually I think are definitional of global citizenship, or what the attempt here is in global citizenship education. One is the notion of shared fate, that we are all part of the same, it's a lifeboat mentality. We're all part of the same, we're all on the same planet, we're all facing the same problems, or many of the same problems. Climate change is the clearest example of that. All of us are going to be affected by climate change in one way or another. So our citizenship is defined by our common, our shared fate as human beings. That it doesn't matter where we live, what our national citizenship is, what our other identities are. We're all human beings in the same lifeboat Earth, and that lifeboat Earth is being threatened. We're all commonly threatened by the same threat. And so we need to respond collectively in conjunction with one another. We must feel that affiliation to each other through that common challenge that we need to respond to. There's another other element of this, which is shared moral obligation or shared ethical stance. Beyond just being in the same lifeboat, we also have certain obligations to each other, which are grounded in some kind of nebulous ethical set of principles. So gender equality, which is one of the SDGs, is clearly grounded not just on practical considerations, but on a sense of the ethical or racial equality is based on the ethical posture that we have. We believe equality, we believe in equality and equity. These are not just shared fate commonalities, but they're shared ethical principles that we have as common human beings. And the other one, the one that's not on the slide that Jose Luis reminded me of, is that we also have a common orientation to human rights. And those are articulated through international instruments like the UN. And in that respect, there's something juridical to them, right? So think about people who, migrants, you know, and who are crossing national borders, either fleeing persecution or seeking, you know, some kind of economic betterment when in another country. You know, they are articulating a right to move, a right to livelihood, a right to protection. So they're articulating their rights, and they're claiming that those rights should override national rights or national claims to maintaining their borders. So when people articulate themselves or articulate their claims in terms of human rights, they're human rights, they're not national rights. They eclipse and circumvent or override national rights. So global citizenship in principle is something that can be grounded in common fate, so education about the challenges that we all face, common ethical principles, if there are such, and there probably are at the base, and also the kind of common rights that we have as human beings. And that's what SDG education is about. And now let me close by saying that, and let me skip through all of these slides, and I think, is it this one? So from the point of view of policy transfer, I think this is a really interesting example that policy transfer and diffusion is not just about the diffusion or transfer of technical policy solutions. How do we best organize our bus system? How do we best deliver mathematics in grade 5? You know, how do we best support single mothers, or how do we organize conditional income transfers, or how do, you know, all of these are, or how do we organize and reduce smoking, for example, cigarette smoking? These are kind of all technical policy instruments or tools that are often spread through international organizations and diffused that way. But there's another part of it here, citizenship and identity formation is also, in the case of the SDGs, particularly in SDG education, clearly something that is also a matter of transfer. International organizations like the UN and many of the NGOs are trying to support a different way of people thinking about themselves in terms of their identities. So I want to, second point is I want to try to understand the more interesting theoretical dimension of my sub-project is trying to understand SDG education as a particular example of this kind of identity diffusion of identity norms, and through international networks. And it's that third conclusion about exploring one element of the Uber transfer, what I call the Uber transfer frame of the SDGs. But for me, one of the more interesting things is going forward is trying to understand the various networks of organizations, governmental, non-governmental, research, organizations that are all contributing in one way or another to this global conversation about SDGs, but SDG education and global citizenship. And I'll close again by coming back to the example of this university, the University of Guadalajara, contributing to the formation of its students as global citizens. You may be surprised, but I just discovered a little while ago, and this is going to be one of the streams of research, that there is an international association for higher educational institutions. HBKU, my university, is part of it. I'm pretty sure University of Guadalajara is part of it. So there's an international network of hundreds of universities that are all dedicated to SDG education around global citizenship, and they're articulating and developing and implementing that within their educational institutions, but they're doing it in cooperation and coordination through a kind of global movement. That's just one example, but think of how interesting that is. And I'll close on this. You get the UN, you get the SDGs as a kind of global policy framework, and then you have elements of that diffusion and that transfer and that articulation that percolate all the way down through to primary school education, but through networks like the one I've just mentioned in higher education, international and global networks of institutions that are organized in the higher educational space that are doing the same thing. So it's a really, to me, really, and it's just my own quirk, I guess, I'm just really fascinated in how what will appear to be a policy-making process at the national level with all the things that Philippe was talking about, policy, atriums and arenas and, you know, all of these actors, but they're going to be acting within this context that's almost above them, like a cloud or a funnel of these international agreements and factors and forces and actors and players all percolating up there like clouds, and then those clouds rain. Okay, I'm going to get poetic here. The rain falls, and these are policy ideas that sprinkle into the domestic policy space through your university. And then you find yourself in a classroom being turned into a global citizen, all because of something that happened in 2015 at the level of the UN. Thank you.
Fulbright Scholar y Teaching Fellow en la Universidad de Pittsburgh y Visiting Fellow en la Universidad de California, San Diego. Es SNI, nivel 3 del Consejo Nacional de Ciencia y Tecnología de México. Actualmente vicepresidente y miembro del Comité Ejecutivo del International Public Policy Association y coordinador del Grupo de Investigación Ejecutivo, Legislativo y Políticas Públicas de la Asociación Mexicana de Ciencias Políticas. Es muy larga semblanza la que tengo aquí, así es que voy a resumir en este momento y pedirte que nos platiques. José Luis nos va a presentar uno de sus últimos libros que se llama Políticas Públicas, Enfoque Estratégico para América Latina. Muchas gracias, José Luis.
Pues presentara una plática de 15 minutos, ¿no? Sobre algún tema de algún proyecto en el cual hubiera venido trabajando. Entonces, en realidad, por eso preferí no preparar un PowerPoint y que versa sobre el proceso de las políticas públicas, ¿no? Que se titula Políticas Públicas, Enfoque Estratégico para América Latina, y por lo tanto pues me pareció que podría ser interesante que yo les hablara de este tema muy brevemente, porque además, bueno, ya llevamos un poquito de tiempo en las presentaciones, entonces sí, la verdad voy a ser muy breve. Quisiera en este sentido hablarles de dos tipos ideales, ¿no? Que en buena medida están considerados aquí en el libro, sobre el proceso de la política pública, ¿no? El primer tipo ideal es, digamos, la visión ortodoxa, ¿no? Clásica sobre el proceso de política pública, que lo ve como un proceso altamente racional, ¿no? Que se desarrolla en un conjunto de etapas. En mi libro yo hablo principalmente de 5 etapas. La etapa que yo llamo de problematización, la etapa de diagnóstico, la etapa de formulación, de ejecución y finalmente de evaluación. Que luego regresa en este ciclo de políticas públicas de nuevo a la problematización, ¿no? Después de una evaluación de una política pública, se reproblematiza, ¿no? Se considera si tuvo los resultados que se esperaban o no, y en función de eso se puede rediseñar y reproblematizar, ¿no? En la visión ortodoxa de políticas públicas, pues se supondría que hay un avance sucesivo en el proceso de políticas públicas a través de estas etapas. Primero, se generan los problemas públicos, sobre todo en la sociedad civil, ¿no? Las organizaciones de la sociedad civil, los medios masivos de comunicación, la misma sociedad es la que genera y discute los problemas principales que para dicha sociedad existen. El Estado retoma esos problemas, ¿no? Y hace un diagnóstico profesional, ¿no? Con analistas profesionales de políticas públicas, usualmente con integrantes del servicio civil de carrera en los países en los que existe, y se hace una propuesta de política pública. Esa propuesta de política pública constituye el proceso de formulación. La política pública entonces se formula, ¿no? Y se elabora y publica eventualmente un programa público, ¿no? Que son los programas sectoriales, por cierto, que aquí en México todos conocemos, ¿no? El programa sectorial de educación, programa sectorial de energía, por ejemplo. Una vez formulada esa política, se ejecuta, ¿no? Y se supondría que se ejecuta como se formula, ¿no? Hubo todo un trabajo de problematización y de diagnóstico, ¿no? Para llegar a una formulación que busca resolver un problema público a través, insisto, de un diagnóstico profesional, ¿no? Entonces, pues lo que se esperaría es que se ejecute esa formulación de la política pública. Se ejecuta y posteriormente se evalúa. Y se evalúa si en efecto ese programa, esa política pública fue adecuada para resolver un determinado problema, y de nuevo se reproblematiza. Hay varios supuestos detrás de esta visión del proceso de políticas públicas. Yo hablaría aquí quizás de tres supuestos. Uno, la existencia de al menos dos importantes actores: los expertos, los analistas de políticas públicas y los políticos. Por otro lado, hay también un clima de confianza mutua y de respeto mutuo por el papel que cada uno de ellos, de estos papeles, juega. El político en una democracia y el experto en la existencia de un servicio profesional de carrera en muchos de estos países. Tercero, en función de esta confianza hay un diálogo entre estos dos actores, ¿no? Donde el experto en políticas públicas le presenta al político su propuesta, su diagnóstico, el político lo analiza, dialoga con el experto y en función de eso se formula, insisto, una determinada política pública. Entonces es la existencia de dos actores relativamente independientes, importantes, ¿no? Que existen como un actor en sí mismo, la confianza, el diálogo para producir, repito, esta política pública que luego se evalúa también de manera relativamente profesional para cambiarla, para que resuelva adecuadamente algún determinado política pública, una determinada política pública. Bueno, el segundo tipo ideal es el contrario, ¿no? Es un proceso en el cual no hay este equilibrio entre políticos y profesionales, sino donde los políticos predominan, donde más que una democracia profesional, que yo le llamo, pues existe alguna medida de autoritarismo, y por lo tanto el profesional como actor y como papel no está tan presente, ¿sí? En donde el político pues decide prácticamente sin consultar a los expertos, muchas veces porque no los hay, ¿no? Porque van y vienen, porque cambian con cada gobierno. Y entonces en realidad, en lugar de iniciar el proceso por la problematización, inicia por la formulación, ¿no? Desde arriba se decide cuál es el problema. Ese problema se trata de presentar como un problema público, ¿no? Al cual sorpresivamente, el político tiene la solución, ¿no? Primero presenta el problema y al día siguiente la solución para demostrar eficacia. Bueno, estoy siendo irónico, obviamente. Pero entonces empieza por la formulación, no por la problematización. No hay un diálogo, ¿no? Porque el actor profesional pues prácticamente no existe, o no existe la voluntad del político de realmente dialogar en términos más técnicos con los profesionales. Hay entonces una falta de confianza, una falta de diálogo, más bien tiende a haber conflicto entre estos actores en la medida que lo puede haber, porque insisto, los políticos predominan. Y ese sería, en síntesis, el segundo tipo ideal. Creo que los países se mueven entre estos dos tipos ideales y se acercan más a un tipo ideal o al otro. En mi opinión, hay un conjunto de países, usualmente son los países llamados de las economías más desarrolladas, se acercan más al primer tipo. Es un tipo ideal, ¿no? No lo estoy presentando aquí como el que ya sucede en estos países, pero sí hay países como, y pues dicen que todas las comparaciones son odiosas, pero también son necesarias, ¿no? Al menos si uno quiere aprender y mejorar. Países como Canadá, donde hay un servicio de carrera consolidado, como Estados Unidos, como Alemania, como Francia, y puedo seguirme con varios otros países como Japón, en cierta medida, para hablar de un país como Corea, como Singapur, ¿no? Curiosamente, pues los países con las economías más desarrolladas, con un mayor bienestar, ¿verdad?, para sus poblaciones, porque para mí, y este es otro tema, pero está parcialmente vinculado, para mí el bienestar y el desarrollo en buena medida depende de la existencia de condiciones necesarias para la acción colectiva, ¿no? Y esa acción colectiva en buena medida también está basada en la confianza interpersonal y en la confianza entre sociedad y Estado. Pues por el otro lado, creo que América Latina se acerca más al segundo tipo ideal, ¿no? Donde hay, y esto está visto en encuestas, ¿no?, hay bajos niveles de confianza, ¿no? Podemos explicarlo de distintas formas, podemos irnos hasta la conquista y la colonia o tener otras explicaciones, pero ahorita no voy a entrar en eso. Creo que es un hecho y las encuestas lo muestran, donde no hay un clima de diálogo entre los actores que pueden estar involucrados con la política pública, principalmente los políticos y los expertos. Claro, varía por país, ¿no? Varía por país. En Brasil existe un servicio profesional bastante consolidado. En Chile también, hasta cierto punto, existe un servicio profesional consolidado. Luego hay otras situaciones intermedias, ¿no?, como México, o que eran intermedias, ya no estoy seguro. A lo mejor ya están dejando de ser intermedias, pero bueno, por un buen tiempo fueron intermedias, porque por un tiempo creo yo que en una medida u otra sí empezó a darse este diálogo entre políticos y expertos. Y bueno, para concluir, y que es una de las conclusiones del libro, creo que esta situación presenta un conjunto de retos para el analista de políticas públicas en los países como los latinoamericanos. Y esos retos tienen que ser enfrentados de una manera estratégica, ¿no? Por lo tanto, en el libro lo que trato de hacer es de presentar distintas recomendaciones al analista de políticas públicas sobre formas en las cuales, como analista, puede ser más estratégico para presentar sus diagnósticos, sus propuestas, ¿no?, sus intentos de diálogo, ¿no?, con los políticos, por estas circunstancias más bien adversas para el analista de políticas públicas y para el análisis de políticas públicas en general. En el libro presento primero una introducción, un primer capítulo donde hablo de estas circunstancias especiales en América Latina, la desconfianza, el conflicto, la falta de diálogo. Hay otras, ¿no? Las carencias, pero bueno, ya no me quiero extender más. El autoritarismo histórico, y luego paso a describir cada una de estas etapas, que son cuáles son los principales autores que las han estudiado en el campo de políticas públicas, y termino cada capítulo con una sección más práctica sobre cómo el analista de políticas públicas podría enfrentar estas circunstancias adversas con acciones más estratégicas, tanto en la etapa de problematización como en la etapa de diagnóstico. Ahí es más difícil ser estratégico, pero bueno, aún así, en la etapa de formulación, en la etapa de ejecución y en la etapa de evaluación. Esa sería pues la conclusión que yo derivaría de esta breve presentación, y pues es en síntesis lo que presento en este libro. Muchas gracias.
Adelante. ¿Qué pasó?
Primero, pues agradecer al instituto, al doctor Cabrero por poner seminario de política pública, que yo creo que va a venir muy bien a la comunidad que estamos aquí interesados en el tema. Y gracias a los profesores, bueno, si puedo, en inglés, thank you for the presentation, the three professor, and thank you, Professor Philippe, for explaining the complexity of the public policy process. Your example was very accurate for explain the complexity and all the issues related to public policy. Mainly, I think you put the focus in the problem. That was very clear. And Professor Leslie, thank you for your presentation. Also, I have a couple of questions about your presentation. One of these is, whether you think that the global regulation could be helpful for reach the SDG. If you think the regulation is an important factor or not to reach better objectives related to SDG. And you put the focus also in the global citizen, global citizenship. And I was thinking about is there a risk to try to create a more homogeneous citizenship around the world? Don't you think there could be erase a problems to this agenda, to all the countries be in one way? There is no maybe erase other problems related to public policy, related to culture. And finally, the professor José Luis, la pregunta solamente